We know Illinois has the second highest property taxes in the nation, and we pay some of the highest sales tax, property tax, income tax, all combined tax. And it's something that you hear time and time again as one of the reasons people flee the state of Illinois. As Illinois has seen outbound migration to where we've lost a seat in Congress, and the total population decline has dropped us from being the fifth most populous to the sixth most populous to the seventh most populous state. And all of these things, it's not just the weather, it's corporate taxes, it's jobs, it's opportunity, it's other policies. I've seen a lot of people announce that they are done with the state of Illinois after the state passed a ban on semi-automatic weapons. So obviously there's a whole host of things that go into this. But what about taxes? A couple of different stories here from various independent sources highlighting that Illinois has an over-reliance on tax, and we have a lot of taxes. Let's go ahead and check out some of the latest headlines here. One of my colleagues at the Center Square put together a national story about how Texas leads the U.S. with the fastest economic expansion. This coming from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where you can see the change in growth, GDP, gross domestic product for each state. Texas leading with 7% growth. So obviously that's a big amount of growth. How did Florida do? About 3.7% growth. Illinois only grew about 0.7, faster than Iowa grew. They actually shrank by 1.2%. But other than Iowa, Illinois is in the region slowest growing, so second slowest growing after Iowa. But you look at Missouri, they grew by 1.9%, Indiana 1.4%, Kentucky grew by 2.2%, Tennessee grew by 4.3%. Now, while it's not a neighboring state, it is very much a state close to us. It's just a stone's throw away, but you can kind of see here how each state fared with their gross domestic product change on an annual rate from quarter 3 of 2022 to quarter 4 of 2022. Texas leading with 7% growth. Illinois only growing 0.7%. So that is not just the GDP. Illinois has historically always trailed the rest of the country when it comes to a variety of different economic indicators. You look at the state's unemployment levels, and even if you watch the charts, remove COVID from the situation. We're not even going to talk about COVID yet, but after the 2007-2008 housing and banking crisis, and you had the Great Recession seep in, it took Illinois more than a decade, and still it didn't get back to where it was before the Great Recession. The unemployment rate lagged the rest of the country by a full percentage point, if not more. The unemployment rate continues to this day to lag the rest of the country when it comes to the overall average unemployment rate. And Illinois still has yet, now considering COVID and the government-imposed lockdowns and the unemployment spike that happened because the government said, you can't have your business. Walmart can stay open, but your small mom-and-pop shop, your small business, which drives about 3 out of every 4 jobs, you got to close down. You can't have operations. You got to be impacted severely. And now we've got to give taxpayer subsidies to all these businesses that were impacted by this decision to close businesses during the pandemic. Now we're going to just throw tax dollars at you. But the unemployment rate has lagged in Illinois behind the rest of the nation historically. After the Great Recession, now after COVID. What are some of the reasons? Well, if you talk to Republicans at the State House, they'll say it's the business environment. It's high corporate taxes, it's high property taxes, it's overregulation, it's high workers' comp costs, high unemployment costs, which is going to cost businesses even more in the years ahead because we had to borrow $4.5 billion to pay for unemployment after the COVID shutdowns imposed by the government, and that led to spikes in unemployment. And by the way, we still don't know how many tax dollars were fraudulently taken by the unemployment system, giving out to bogus people. So we still don't have the grand scope of that. Regardless, Illinois only growing 0.7%, while a state like Texas grew 7% in their GDP in the final quarter of 2022, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So again, just take a look at that map. You can find this One of my colleagues writing about this at the Center Square, how Texas leads the U.S.'s fastest economic expansion, Illinois only growing about 0.7%. Not the only thing looking at this morning. You've got Pew Charitable Trusts putting out a fascinating review of what they say are the reliance on taxes for revenue. And Illinois coming in at third at a reliance of 57% behind Minnesota and California when it comes to states most reliant on taxes for revenue. And you can see they've got a GIF here that kind of spells out some of the different various indicators that they're looking at. And if you actually click through, you can see that they lay out where states get their money. They've got the chart there. Illinois gets about 57% from taxes for the revenue, third of all states. They get about 31% from federal funds. Again, you hear a lot of Illinois not getting nearly as much back from the federal government as they give the federal government. But looking at this chart from Pew Charitable Trusts from fiscal year 2021, the most recent full set of fiscal data that Pew Charitable Trust has access to, and you can see that Illinois is third on the list for federal taxes that they get. Or overall taxes. So third on the list for taxes, 57%. They get 31% of federal funds. We'll just pull this back up for you. Service charges, about 5.1%. Miscellaneous, about 5.8%. And then local funds, Illinois gets about 5%. So third overall when you combine all those taxes. And let's just take a look at, so California gets 27.8% in federal funds. Minnesota gets 29.3% in federal funds. Illinois gets 31.6% in federal funds. There are other states that get more in federal funds. Nevada gets more in federal funds. Let's see here. Maryland gets 37.7% in federal funds. Then Idaho gets 38.7% in federal funds. So there might be an argument that Illinois doesn't get nearly as much back in federal funds as it needs, but still it shows that Illinois is over-reliant on taxes to pay for essential services rather than fees or miscellaneous revenue that might come into the state. So interesting to see that. And one of the things that could play into this even more is cigarette taxes. And this is something we'll get to here in a moment, but the Tax Foundation putting out their cigarette tax and cigarette smuggling by state for the year 2020. And what they highlight in their report, in particular, Illinois and New Mexico significantly increased their cigarette tax from 2019 to 2020. Both states saw major increases in cigarette smuggling. Are you surprised? Do you know people who go down to, say, Missouri every month, even though it's not necessarily above board and more kind of like Silk Road type stuff? Do you know people who go down to Missouri and grab, cartons of cigarettes that they're saving $40-50 on per carton to bring them back to Illinois because Illinois' cigarette taxes are among the highest in the nation. We'll talk about that coming up next here on WMAY. It is Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and talking about taxation and growth and how Illinois fares on those topics. And of course, if you follow along, you can check out the centersquare.com, where one of my colleagues put a story together about the overall GDP change of states, Texas leading. Illinois, not at the bottom, but not that great. While Texas grew at 7% in the GDP in the final quarter of 2022, Illinois only grew 0.7%. So you've got that. You've also got Pew putting out a showing of how reliant states are on taxes, and in particular, Illinois is the third most reliant state on taxes for revenue. And this is a breakdown of some of the taxes taking up 57%, while federal funds get about 31%. And a lot of this, as Pew says, was from the billions in COVID-19 pandemic relief aid for fiscal year 2021. They say the share increased by less than a percentage point from fiscal year 2020 levels, but still set a record at 36.7%. However, federal funds were the largest revenue source in fewer states, 15, than a year earlier, 18. So you can read some of the Pew research there and break down how reliant various states are on taxes for revenue. But speaking of revenue, you've got cigarette taxes, which are very much an interesting analysis that you can do when you look at states and their different tax rates for cigarettes. And the Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan group, looks at every state and their latest cigarette taxes and cigarette smuggling by state released. And it shows that, in particular, Illinois and New Mexico increasing their cigarette taxes from 2019 to 2020. I think it was like an extra $1 a pack. Both states saw major increases in cigarette smuggling. So if you go through and check out this report from the Tax Foundation, you can evaluate the tobacco tax differentials and how that incentivizes smuggling. You've got the Mackinac Center of Public Policy estimating the cigarette smuggling rates for each state. In the most recent report for 2020 data, it shows a strong positive relationship between cigarette smuggling and the tax rates across the U.S. and the District of Columbia. Then you go further down and you look at just how much we're talking about here and the changes in smuggling rates and revenues for states that increase cigarette taxes. Illinois, a 14% smuggling rate change, and that's the 9th largest change, with $199 million in lost revenue estimated because Illinois' cigarette taxes are so high and people will go to other states to smuggle cigarettes into Illinois. So they're estimating nearly $200 million in lost revenue, while you've got other states, neighboring Indiana, for instance, $42 million extra because, well, people are, say, for instance, leaving Illinois to go to Indiana to buy smokes. The tax revenue from that goes to Indiana instead of Illinois. By people trying to avoid paying those high cigarette taxes. You continue to look at all of these different states and where they're at with their smuggling rates, and pulling up another chart here from the Tax Foundation. And Illinois, 29% is number 7 when it comes to cigarette smuggling by state. And this is, of course, the smuggled cigarettes that are consumed on a percentage of total cigarettes consumed. And just fascinating. You know, tax policy, you like to think it's isolated in a silo. Not when you have 50 different states all taking different approaches, and I think that's one thing you see in this wonderful experiment of a constitutional republic, where you've got 50 different mini democracies, and when it comes from economic expansion and how that could be hindered by policies versus the amount of tax revenue that is used to pay for services, to how that tax revenue is put on certain products like cigarettes or gas, for instance, because as we talked about earlier, gas tax is also among the highest in the country here in Illinois, the highest in the region. And with OPEC looking at cutting production starting in May, you can imagine that's going to increase the overall price. And with Illinois already having high taxes on that, it's going to make it even more expensive. So maybe people are going over to Missouri or Indiana to get their smokes and fill up their gas tanks and then head back home. We'll be back at it tomorrow.
From the Fly SPI Studios, take the easy way